Hi, this week we're going to be talking about how to analyze the BRI, and that is compiling all of the data and making some decisions based on trends or patterns that we see. And the first thing that I'm going to show you today is how to fill out the performance booklet cover. And as we talk, you guys have noticed that each section in the BRI, A, B, C, D, E, has its own word list, its own passages. It also has its own cover page. You actually only have to fill out one of the cover pages for all of the work that you do with the student and the BRI. And I am right now on the website that I gave you guys, this one here. Um, and I selected this expert noticing and answers for practice exercising, and then I paged down to page 3. And that's what I'm looking at right here. And this is an example of a filled out form. So based on this particular student. Over here, you'll see they put the word lists in isolation. There's site analysis and total, and then your overall level is independent. And then that was kindergarten end of year. Then there was first grade beginning, 16, 4, and 20 independent. There are no middle and year end word lists in isolation, you may have noticed. So it moves right to second grade, 14 site, 2 analysis, 16 total, which put the reader at instructional, and 9, 2, and 11 put the reader at frustration. So this here is the word list in isolation. Remember the reason we used the word list. The word list were in order for us to determine where to begin the graded passages. So this particular reader, one level below our highest independent, so they started here on kindergarten, end of year for the passage, and then they listed the number of errors or miscues and the number of comprehension questions missed, and then their overall level. So you fill in each section. If you did a words per minute on one of those, as I've asked you to do, please enter the words per minute and the norm percentile there. Also, down here you'll notice that they put the estimate of reading levels. And so we're looking at independent, they determined to be end of first grade. And if we look here at first grade, we have one error in reading and one error in comprehension. So that's safe to say that that level is independent. Moving down to the next level though, the errors in the reading became a little bit more with 2, so that's instructional, and a little bit more comprehension. So they considered that instructional. And then frustration, in instructional again, let's see, 1E, grade 2 was instructional, and grade 3 was frustrational. So they put the levels down here, 1E, 2, and 3. And that's what you'll be asked to do. There are several pages on here that you can look at if you're not sure how to complete the form. Fill out the top the best that you can, and then we will get to this part. We will get to some additional parts later on this form, but this is a practice form, so I just wanted you to practice determining the levels. And, and we do that by looking at the comprehension questions and the word reading overall for each level. Now, if you have a reader who, if you want to put the silent reading on the form, you can do that in a couple of ways, and I will show you because it doesn't have a spot on here for the silent reading. But these practice pages in the on the website are really just to help you figure out where to put the information and how to determine the overall level of the student. So that's all you have to do for this form. A couple other things about this form to keep in mind. Reading levels generally go in order, but that isn't necessarily always the case. Sometimes we have to, as we've talked, add another level, maybe give a passage B or C because we had results that weren't necessarily going in order. So we might have a first grade independent, a second grade frustration, and a third grade instructional. That doesn't mesh. So we typically want to see independent instructional frustration. Sometimes that happens so we pull in another passage from another section to determine which one truly is the instructional versus the frustration level. In addition, you will always have the independent will always be one level, the frustration will always be one level, but the instructional level can be 2 grades. So you could have a 2-3 instructional level, but independent and frustration, we're only going to use one. And hopefully you'll be able to really hone in and figure out what that instructional level is as well, even if you have to do an extra passage or two. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of the forms that we're going to complete in the, and these are at the end of the BRI on the practice pages after all of the protocol sheets. But I've also posted them in Canvas so you can easily print out the 3 pages, 4 pages that you need. This is the first one. It's called Summary of Students, Miscues, and Oral Reading. And you're going to list each error that the student makes, and you're going to put it in different columns. So, for example, with my sample student, I have Kirk, and on his first passage, he I will have his available for you as well, so that you can see where I'm getting this information from. I'm going to give you his sample pages as well as his completed pages of these forms. And I'll try to walk through them the best that I can, but it's going to be very challenging with you being able to see the print. And so we're going to have to kind of work on this a little bit together as well next week. So for Kirk, his first error was care for car. And you can see it says, he said, is it a care? And then he corrected it, is it a car? And so that he was given him his, a substitution for his miscue, but he did self-correct it. However, we are going to put it on the form, and on the forms, even though it was self-corrected. Now, over here, he has said, been liked in the box instead of looked, so he self-corrected that. And then he said there was 2 apples. And then he added the word very down at the bottom, a very good friend. And on this line, we put miscue, a substitution for liked for look, but he did self-correct it. And he said was for were, that was a meaning change because of the grammar. And he had 1 repetition there. And then down here, he had an omission, and a very good friend did not change the meaning. So we know how to do this part. We've already practiced this, but I want to show you how we're going to take this information and put it on this form here. So on this form, his first error was care for car. And if we think about the word care and car, you will be thinking about how those words look similarly. And they are different. Care for car, they are different endings because they are similar. Care for car. They are similar in a lot of parts, but there's only one difference, and that's that silent E for care. So we're going to put care for car in that spot. So this is putting those other errors on the form. He said was for were, so that's different in several parts. And he said liked for looked, and that's different in the middle. So right now, on this form, we are looking at how the words are different from each other. Keep that in mind because later we're going to look at how the words graphically are similar. Now, I'm going to page down here and show you that there are some other areas that we're also going to be looking at. He did have an insertion, so we're going to write the word very in this section. And so that is for his first passage. For the second passage, his errors were boats for boots, and that was a substitution with a meaning change. He said there for here, substitution meaning change. He said pulled for put, and he again said there for here. So that gave him a total of 4 errors, and all 4 were significant, as you can see. And then there was some notes here that he was choppy. And these examples are, again, in Canvas for you to view. But back to this form. So this is the form completed after I looked at the 3 passages, all of the errors, and you can see from the different beginnings, there's there for here, when for then. Different middles, liked for look, boats for boots, driving for diving, too hard for toward, any for away, care for car, pulled for put, breeze for breezy, my for me, have different endings. Different in several parts was for were, he for I, high for hawk. And then there was the insertion very, the omission and, there were 2 repetitions, and there was miscellaneous was for saw, that reversal. So what I can do is I can look at this form overall, and I can see a lot of the errors that this particular student is making are words in the middle. So the reader is not necessarily looking carefully through the word. I can also tell that a lot of them don't make any sense because they're non-words, like too hard for toward, and or words that are going to change the grammar. And when I just briefly look at this, I can tell that this student is maybe not carefully watching at the beginning of words, and especially some of those sight words, some of those words like there for here, there when for then, any for away, my for me, he for I, was for were, pulled for put, my for me, was for saw, liked for look. Those are all high frequency words, and it seems to me that maybe he's guessing, and sometimes he does self-correct based on, that not making sense or sounding okay, but he's not looking carefully through the word, and he's not thinking first about the word and then trying it. And so that's probably something that I would make a note of for this student, is that high frequency words, they're not firm, or he's doing some guessing, which is really a bad habit. And it's better to teach to look first and then try, and make sure we know what's the difference between where, there, and here. How are they the same? How are they different? Well, there starts with a TH, here starts with an H. So that's a strategy or remediation that you could do with a student, that it's having some of these substitutions where the words look similar, and but they're not the same word, and any for away, liked for looked. This reader really needs to look at those words carefully and know how they're the same, how they're different, and that's a strategy that you can teach them as when you have a reader like this that is substituting words that are visually similar. So that is the summary of oral reading, the summary of students' miscues in oral reading. There's another form that we're going to use that you're just tallying, and I'll show you that form next. This is our next form, and it is the miscue tally and reading behavior summary charts, and we're going to use the same student that we used with the first one. And just so you know, this student, when I gave this student the test, they didn't have a K1, K beginning, middle, and end, first grade beginning, middle, and end. Thank goodness they do now, because we know how much those readers change through those years. So I'm going to change the form a little bit just to show you, to fit this particular student in there. He did primer 1 and 2. So on this form, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through all of the pages that my student has read, and we're still looking at the oral reading here, not the comprehension. And when I look at his first passage, which is passage B, for the primer level, when I look at that first passage, I am going to count across the bottom how many substitutions, insertions, repetitions, and we're going to do this by level. So for the primer, I'm just going to take the information right off of the bottom where we've already totaled it right here, and I'm going to enter that information onto my form. So he's going to have 3 substitutions, 1 insertion, 0 omissions, and looking down at the bottom, 1 repetition, 2 self-corrections, and 1 meaning change. And I'm going to do that with each passage that the reader read to me orally, We're just on oral reading because those are the only mistakes that we know that the reader made and that we can analyze. So I'm not sure how well you can actually see this form, and I do apologize for that. Try to move it a little closer for you. But what I did was I put primer 1, 2 over here on the far side, and then on the primer he had 3 substitutions, 1 insertion, 0 omissions, 0 reversals. He had 1 repetition, 2 self-corrections of unacceptable miscues, and 1 meaning change. And then I did the same thing for the first grade and the second grade passage, and then I put the totals in there. So this form is really just a tally sheet of the overall totals. And what the form can tell us is that he had 15 substitutions, and of those substitutions, 11 of them changed the meaning. So that's pretty significant. Right there's another area that I know that this student is going to need to work on, because over half, 2/3 of his errors are changing the meaning, which is a problem, as we know. And then he's also self-correcting. He self-corrected 6 of those. So that's not a terrible self-correction rate, but we do want to see that increase, especially with some of these words that aren't making sense in text. Our next form to look at the miscues is the qualitative summary of miscues. And all of this is in the slides, and it walks you through step by step for each particular error and how to do this for each form. So I'm just going to give you a brief highlight of it here, and then we can talk individually if we need to, and during our Zoom session I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. But using our sample student, I do want to show you how to get this form started, and then you'll be able to see the completed form also in Canvas. But for the first error, if you remember, Kirk said care for car, and we still have to go back to his passages because we're going to have to again look at, did that change the meaning and did it not? But for the first miscue, we put care for car. So you're just putting in what the error was and what the text said. And we know that that looks similar at the beginning and the middle. And it changed the meaning, but he did self-correct it. So we're going to put those check marks in those boxes. The next error was liked for look. And similarly, it looks the same at the beginning and the end. And it was also an unacceptable error that was self-corrected. So you can see how I'm checking those boxes based on the individual errors. So I'm going to fill in some of the form and then turn it back on and show you a couple of the things that we have to do with particular words or errors. So here I added was for were, and they're similar at the beginning, but it was an unacceptable miscue in context. The next error that I looked at was very. It was that insertion, very good friend. And since there was no text, we have to put a dash here. There's no error to analyze because there wasn't a text. So we have very, the text was blank, and then we have to put X's through all 3 of these boxes. And the reason for that is there's nothing to compare it to. So we don't want to skew our numbers because we're going to come up with percentages for beginnings, middles, and ends. How many percent of his errors were graphically the same at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And since there wasn't a word there, we don't want that to figure into our percentages. So we put an X's through here, but it was an acceptable error, as we had determined earlier. So I've added a few more of his errors on here, and a couple that in particular you'll want to notice. We talked about the omission, the insertion, very, and we put those X's across there, and that means we're not going to analyze them. Down here you'll see another dash because the reader omitted a word. The text said and, but the reader did not. So we put a dash on this side where it says miscue, and again, I'm Xing out all 3 boxes because the reader, there's nothing to compare it to. The reader didn't say anything. And so I X that out, but I still put in here that it was an acceptable miscue, and it was self-corrected though. And then you'll notice here, my for me. Now that's only a 2-letter word, so my does not have a middle. It has a beginning, it has an end. So you can see here, we can only compare the beginning and the end. So mine for me does look similar at the beginning. The middles, there is no middle, and the ends are different, so I'm going to leave that blank. But I am going to determine that it was an unacceptable error, but it was also self-corrected. Same thing for he for I. I is the text. I has only a beginning. There's no middle, there's no end. So we can only analyze the beginning, which is this blank box right here. The X's go in the middle and the end boxes, and that's because there's nothing to analyze. But do they look similar at the beginning? He for I, no. Those two letters are completely different looking. So no check mark there, and it was an unacceptable miscue to make. And then we have any for away. It looks similar at the beginning and the end, not in the middle, and it was an unacceptable miscue. So we're going to do this with all of Kirk's errors, and then we're going to total up to see what the percentages are for each of these areas to get a quantitative number so that we can make some decisions based on that data. I'm going to show you the completed form, and then we'll talk about how to get those percentages. So here's the completed form, and yes, yours is also going to look very similar to that. We listed all of the errors that this particular student has made in oral reading, and we analyzed each one of them. And down here at the bottom, I put the column totals. And I'm going to show you a couple things about the column totals of how I came up with these numbers. So first of all, let's look at the beginning. We had 11 miscues that Kirk made that were similar at the beginning. And so we have those checked. I counted all the check marks and I came up with 11. But how many words had beginnings? How many miscues did we actually analyze? How many chances did he have to get a beginning correct? And so we're not going to count our words that don't have beginnings, like the X's. So we're only counting the blank boxes and check marks, and that's how we come up with 15. Okay, if you go up here and count all the check marks and all the blank boxes, that's going to tell you how many that he was able to attempt. He can't attempt a word that doesn't exist, so our omission and our insertion do not count into this number here. That's why you're going to see 17 over here, because over here when we're talking about acceptable or not acceptable, all of the errors are going to count. But the errors such as omissions and insertions are not going to count in the beginning, middles, and ends because they don't have a beginning, middle, and an end. And so that's how we got these numbers. You divide 11 by 15 and you get 73%. So what that tells us is that Kirk's oral miscues that he made in all of his passages that we recorded, 11 of them had similar beginnings out of 15. So that gives him a 73% graphic similarity for the beginnings of his error. So most of the time, 3/4 of the time, Kirk is getting the first part. And remember, in the slides, we talk about how to determine graphic similarity. We look at the word and we visually split it into thirds. And in order for it to get credit here for the beginning, it has to have the exact same first letter. The middle and the end don't have to be exact, they just have to be similar. And you'll see how we determine that in some places. And there may be some debate on whether you would have checked this box or that box. And we've talked about that before with meaning change. And, you know, just use your best judgment. If you're not sure, you can send me a picture of it. You can send me a text and ask me. You can call me and ask me. I'd be happy to walk you through this form, especially because this form gives you a lot of great information. And every single one of you will be able to determine some strengths and needs from this form alone, and determines some instructional routes to go from here. I did the same thing in the middle column. There were 7 middles that he said accurately, or that looked similar. Didn't say accurately. They were miscues, but they look similar in the middle of the word. Out of 13. Again, I can't count the X's, which is where we have our 1-letter word or our 2-letter words, because there are no middles. So there were only 13 words that had middles that we could even analyze, so that he could even attempt. So again, I get the percentage here, 54% of the middles were graphically similar. Did the same thing on the ends with 7 out of 14, gave us a 50%. And so definitely Kirk is getting more graphic similarity at the beginning of the words, although he still is doing some guessing as we talked about earlier. And middle and ends of the words, they look similar about half the time. Doesn't mean they make sense or that they are acceptable or that they're self-corrected. So let's take a look at that. Over here we have two of his initial miscues were actually acceptable in context. And I think they were the omission and the insertion. Those actually didn't change the meaning. So he has 2 out of 17. And so 12% of the time at his initial attempt, we're not talking about self-corrections yet, but at his initial attempt, 12% of the time that those words made sense and didn't change the grammar. They have to grammatically be okay, and they have to also not change the meaning or make sense in context. So that's very poor. That's definitely a red flag for this particular student. But let's take a look over here what we have. We have 15 errors initially, miscues, that were unacceptable in context. Out of the 17, there were 15. So we know that's, a very small percentage of acceptable errors. So he had 15, but out of that 15, how many did he self-correct? He self-corrected 6. And that gives me a 40%. 6 divided by 15 gives me the 40%. So 40% of his errors he did self-correct, which isn't terrible. That does give us a 1 to 4 ratio, and we talked before about the lower the ratio, the better when it comes to error. That's for every 4 errors, he made 1 self-correction. So it's not a terrible self-correction rate, but we definitely want to lower that and reduce the number of initial unacceptable miscues. So we do know that some meaning and structure is kicking in for him, and about not quite half of the time, it is helping him correct his errors. So we have a 40% self-correction rate percent for the unacceptable miscues. Now, I went over here and I colored in these columns. So here's your 40% self-correction rate. Up at the top, I colored in the beginning, middle, and end, and the 12% for unacceptable, for miscues acceptable in context. So this is how we're going to fill out the form. Now, what can this form tell us? Very quickly, this form tells me, when I'm thinking about Kirk and looking for patterns, that he needs to work on, he's definitely making too many errors, okay? So that's something, and his reading was choppy, it was slow, he was having to go back and repeat and fix some things, and you can see by the unacceptable miscues, he's guessing, he is using he's using a lot of beginnings, he's using some middles and some ends, but that meaning and structure is not always kicking in when it needs to help him. And we want all of those, we want that to all happen prior to him making the error. That's what an efficient reader does. They are working through those systems prior to that error being made. We don't want him to make the error, then have to stop, go back, repeat, self-correct, because again, that's going to interrupt the flow of comprehension. So we see a strength, some word beginnings that are graphically similarity. You could mention that the middles and ends, half the time look okay, that look similarly. We can also talk about that we are seeing 40% self-correction rate. Again, though, we are seeing a lot of words, a lot of those sight words we've already talked about earlier, that look similar, that are not the same, and they do change the structure or the meaning. So we want to be careful about that. We want to focus on that. And then also that unacceptable in context, that is definitely a red flag. And if this is your student and you don't have something in your strengths and weaknesses for this unacceptable rate, then you've missed a big piece. And that's what this form is going to tell you. Are they self-correcting? Are they noticing their errors or monitoring? What is their self-correction rate? And are they using meaning? Are they using structure? Or are they using the visual to make things graphically similar? Now, interestingly enough, Kirk's comprehension, as we will see as we move forward to the comprehension page, summary page, was actually pretty good. So even though this particular reader had a really tough time here with the fluency and with some of the miscues, it didn't affect the comprehension very much. And this is not uncommon for a particular reader such as this one. He was a second grader at this time. He had a great vocabulary, he had a lot of experiences, he'd had a lot of exposure to text. His parents read to him when he was growing up, he read books at home. He had a lot of great vacations and field trips, so he had a lot of background knowledge and was able to pull together some meaning from text, even though it wasn't it wasn't actually what he read. So it's kind of interesting how some students are going to be really strong here or really strong here, and then comprehension suffers. I know some of you I've talked to that you have these really great word readers. They're automatic word callers. They read beautifully. They even spell pretty well. They can read words in isolation. But when it comes to comprehension, they don't have the information that they need once they've read it. They can't recall it. They can't put it together. Then we have readers such as this one, and that he has a really hard time with getting those words out smoothly, fluently, in a way that's coherent and that makes sense. And then he gets to the comprehension, and he's somehow able to pull that all together and make sense of it. And so that is a reader that we call a slow comprehender, meaning the reading is slow, but he's comprehending well. And I'll refer to those different types of readers in another video segment next week. But wanted to just show you these particular summary forms this week. And if you have questions on that one, you can always let me know.